In December of 2020, the cybersecurity firm FireEye noticed something unusual in its own network. A security audit had flagged an unrecognized device that appeared to have been registered using multi-factor authentication. Someone had enrolled a new device in FireEye's authentication system, and the registration hadn't been authorized by any employee FireEye could identify. What FireEye found when it investigated was not a targeted attack on FireEye specifically. It was the trailing edge of an operation that had been running undetected for approximately 9 months, that had penetrated the networks of the United States Treasury Department, the Department of State, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the National Institutes of Health, and an estimated 18,000 organizations globally. The entry point was a software update. SolarWinds is a company based in Austin, Texas, that produces IT management and monitoring software used by large organizations to track the health and performance of their computer networks. Its flagship product, Orion, is installed on the networks of corporations, government agencies, and major institutions worldwide. It is, by design, deeply integrated into the network it monitors, with broad access to the systems whose performance it tracks. In early 2020, attackers, subsequently attributed with high confidence by the United States intelligence community to a Russian intelligence operation, specifically the SVR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, operating through a group known in the security community as Cozy Bear or APT-29, had achieved access to SolarWinds' internal software development environment. What they did with this access was not what most people think of when they think of hacking. They did not steal data from SolarWinds. They did not disrupt SolarWinds' operations. They did not announce their presence in any way. Instead, they inserted a small piece of malicious code into the build process for Orion, the automated system by which SolarWinds compiled its software from source code and assembled it into the installer packages that customers would download and run. The malicious code was designed to be dormant for approximately 2 weeks after installation, then to activate and establish a communications channel with attacker-controlled servers. The channel communicated over standard HTTPS traffic, encrypted web traffic of the kind that any ordinary network generates in enormous quantities, using communication protocols carefully designed to resemble the legitimate telemetry that Orion already generated as part of its monitoring function. The malicious code was then compiled into the legitimate Orion software update, cryptographically signed with SolarWinds' authentic code signing certificate, the digital signature that tells operating systems the software comes from a trusted source, and pushed through SolarWinds' normal update distribution mechanism. Between March and June of 2020, approximately 18,000 organizations downloaded and installed the compromised update. The operational sophistication of what the attackers did after installation distinguished this operation from ordinary malware campaigns. After the 2-week dormancy period, the malware established its command and control communications, but it did not immediately begin stealing data or moving laterally through the network. It waited. It observed. For weeks or months in some cases, the malware sat on compromised Orion servers and collected information about the network environment before any active intrusion began. This patience served multiple purposes. It allowed the malware to identify security monitoring systems that might detect its activity and calibrate its behavior to avoid triggering them. It allowed the attackers to identify which compromised organizations were of sufficient intelligence value to pursue more deeply. And it contributed to the operation's 9-month undetected run, aggressive early. Activity is what gets malware caught, and this operation was not aggressive. When the attackers did identify a target worth penetrating more deeply, an organization whose networks held intelligence the SVR consider valuable, they moved carefully. They used the Orion server's legitimate, trusted access to the network as a starting point for lateral movement, mimicking normal network traffic patterns to avoid detection. They forged authentication tokens, digital credentials that allowed them to impersonate legitimate users, using techniques that bypassed multi-factor authentication systems that were supposed to prevent exactly this. In the networks they penetrated most deeply, including the U.S. Treasury and the Department of State, the attackers read emails, accessed internal systems, and move through the network with the patience and discretion of spies rather than the speed of criminals. What they collected remains classified. The full scope of what was read, copied, or observed in the 9 months the operation ran before detection has never been publicly disclosed. The SolarWinds operation represented the maturation of supply chain attacks as a strategic intelligence methodology. The fundamental insight behind a supply chain attack is that large, security-conscious organizations often invest heavily in defending their own perimeter, their firewalls, their authentication systems, their endpoint security, while relying on the security of the software and services they purchase from third-party vendors. If an attacker can compromise a trusted vendor and embed malicious code in a product that the target organization will voluntarily install, the entire perimeter defense is bypassed. The victim installs the attacker's code themselves with administrator privileges because the code is signed and trusted. SolarWinds was an ideal vector for this attack for several reasons. Orion was widely deployed across exactly the organizations the SVR was most interested in: government agencies, defense contractors, technology companies, and financial institutions. Orion's design gave it broad, trusted network access. It needed this access to do its legitimate monitoring job. Orion updates were applied routinely and trusted automatically. And SolarWinds, like most software companies, had not been designed with the assumption that its own build environment might be a target. The specific technique of inserting malicious code into a software build pipeline, rather than into the source code itself, which is subject to code review, was sophisticated. The malicious code appeared in the compiled binary, but not in the source files that developers work with and review. Detecting it required examining the compiled output rather than the source, which is not a standard step in most software development security processes. The attribution of the attack to the SVR was made on the basis of multiple technical and behavioral indicators that, in combination, pointed strongly toward a specific Russian intelligence unit with a documented history of operations with similar characteristics. These indicators included the specific malware techniques used, the command and control infrastructure, the targeting priorities, and certain operational security practices that are consistent across known SVR operations. Russia denied involvement. The denial was consistent with its standard response to such attributions and was not accompanied by any alternative explanation of the technical evidence. The United States government's response included sanctions against Russian entities, the expulsion of Russian diplomats, and a series of executive orders aimed at strengthening the security requirements for software used in federal government systems. The concept of a software bill of materials, a formal declaration of the components and dependencies in a piece of software, analogous to the ingredient list on a food product, gained significant momentum in federal cybersecurity policy as a direct response to the supply chain attack. Methodology the SolarWinds operation demonstrated. The deeper question raised by the SolarWinds operation is structural and has not been answered by any of the post-incident policy responses. Modern organizations run on software they did not write, from vendors whose security practices they cannot directly audit, updated through automated mechanisms they trust, because the alternative, manually verifying every software update, is operationally impossible. The complexity of the software supply chain, in which any given application may incorporate dozens of third-party libraries, which themselves incorporate dozens more, means that the attack surface is not just the organization's own code, but the entire ecosystem of code it depends on. The SolarWinds attack was executed by a nation-state intelligence service with the resources, patience, and technical capability to compromise a software vendor's build process and maintain a covert operation across 18,000 organizations for 9 months. The defensive response required for an organization to protect against this category of attack is not simply better firewalls or stronger authentication. It requires visibility into the security of every piece of software in the organization's environment, a standard that is difficult to define and essentially impossible to fully achieve. That gap between the attack capability a sophisticated adversary can bring and the defensive capability that even well-resourced organizations can realistically achieve is the enduring lesson of SolarWinds. The operation succeeded not because of any single defensive failure, It succeeded because it attacked the trust infrastructure that makes modern computing function.